Welcome to the Down and Dirty Hippie, the place where history, culture, and current events collide. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, today we're going to be tackling, well, I guess you could say kind of the big one, huh? The U.S. Constitution.
Yeah, that's a pretty foundational document, wouldn't you say?
You could say that. So we're going to break it all down for you.
Distill it down to the essentials, you know?
Exactly.
Okay.
Now, I got to tell you, one thing that really struck me going through this is how much this document, I mean, we're talking centuries ago, still affects us today.
It's remarkable, isn't it? I mean, the Constitution's not just some, dusty old relic. It's really the bedrock of our whole system. All the debates we have, about rights, about power, about how our society should function, it all goes back to this one document.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start really basic here. How is this thing structured?
Well, you can think of it kind of like a building, You've got the preamble, which is like the mission statement, I guess you could say, sets out the goals. Then you've got the articles. Those are the main structural components. They outline the three branches of government: the legislative, executive, and judicial.
Right.
And then finally, you have the amendments. Think of those like renovations and additions, to keep the building up to date.
So the articles, that's where they really lay out how power is divided, right? I mean, we all learn about the three branches of government in school, but it's easy to forget, I think, how radical that idea was back in the 1700s.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, back then, most of the world was ruled by, kings and queens.
Monarchs.
Right, monarchs, or small, powerful elites. The founders of the U.S., they were breaking from that. They wanted to prevent tyranny, and they believed that dividing power was the way to do it.
Okay, so walk us through these three branches. What does each one actually do?
All right, so Article 1 sets up the legislative branch. That's Congress, the folks who make the laws.
The lawmakers.
Exactly. Then you've got Article 2, which establishes the executive branch, headed by the president. They're the ones who, carry out the laws, manage the day-to-day running of the country. And then Article 3, that creates the judicial branch with the Supreme Court at the top. They make sure the laws are constitutional and are applied fairly.
So it's not just about dividing power. It's also about making sure no one branch gets too powerful, right? That's where this whole idea of checks and balances comes in.
Exactly. The framers, they were really worried about any one branch having too much power. So they built in these checks and balances, giving each branch ways to limit or counter the actions of the others.
So it's not just a simple, rock, paper, scissors kind of analogy, though, is it?
No, it's much more complex than that.
Right. So can you give us an example, in the real world, how these checks and balances actually play out?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's take, for example, the president's power to veto laws passed by Congress. That's a big check on the legislative branch. But then Congress can override that veto with a supermajority vote. And even if a law is passed and signed, the courts can step in and say, nope, this is unconstitutional. So you see, there's this constant push and pull.
It's a negotiation.
Exactly. And that's what makes the system so dynamic, so fascinating, really. It's designed for debate, for disagreement, for ongoing negotiation about how power should be balanced in a free society.
So can we take a recent example, maybe those debates we've been having over executive orders?
Sure. So the president can issue executive orders to direct federal agencies, but Congress can push back, by passing laws or even cutting funding. And then, of course, the courts can review the legality of those orders. It's all about, making sure everyone stays in their lane, so to speak.
Right. So it's not a static system. It's constantly evolving.
Exactly. And that's why it's still relevant today, centuries later.
Okay. So we've been talking about this back and forth between the branches of government, but there's another whole section of the Constitution we got to dig into, the Bill of Rights.
Right, the first 10 amendments.
Yeah, these are the classic, individual liberties, right?
Yeah, you can really see, I think, how concerned people were, back then coming out of a monarchy, that they wanted to make sure these basic freedoms were protected.
What explicitly spells out.
Exactly. And it's interesting, I think, to look at which of those rights were considered the most the most pressing back then, and how that's maybe shifted over time.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, think about the First Amendment, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion. For the framers, those were absolutely essential. They just fought a war to break away from a king who, tried to control what people said and thought.
Right. They didn't want that happening again.
No, absolutely not. And of course, the First Amendment is still incredibly relevant today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at all the debates we have about free speech on the internet,
Right, exactly. And it's not just the First Amendment. I mean, the Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures, that's huge in the digital age.
Yeah, all that data that's being collected about us all the time.
It's a whole new frontier, really. And the courts are constantly trying to figure out how to apply these, centuries-old principles to these modern problems.
So really, it just shows that the Constitution, it's not just a static document.
Yeah.
It's
It's a living document.
yeah, exactly. It has to be interpreted and reinterpreted as our society changes.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. The framers, they couldn't have predicted the internet or smartphones or, AI.
Yeah.
But they created a framework that was flexible enough to adapt.
And that's part of what makes it so impressive, honestly.
Absolutely.
And of course, we can't forget about all the times the Constitution has actually been amended.
Oh, right. 27 times, I think it is now.
Yeah, something like that. I mean, that shows that the framers knew they weren't perfect, right? Yeah. They understood that future generations might need to make changes.
Right, and they built in a process for doing that.
Okay, so we've talked about the Bill of Rights, but I mean, any other amendments that you think really illustrate this idea of a living constitution?
Well, the 19th Amendment comes to mind, giving women the right to vote. I mean, women fought for decades, for generations, really, to achieve that right.
And they face so much opposition.
So much opposition, yeah. It's a really powerful example of how social movements can use the Constitution to push for change, to expand, the definition of who we the people really are.
And I mean, you can draw a line from that amendment to so many other changes, right? I mean, not just suffrage, but greater participation by women in every aspect of society.
Oh, absolutely. And it shows, I think, that the fight for equality and inclusion, it's an ongoing process. Each generation faces its own challenges, and the Constitution provides, the framework for those debates.
So we've talked about the structure of the Constitution, the branches of government, the Bill of Rights, all these amendments. I mean, it's a lot.
It is a lot, yeah.
But I think it's easy to forget that this document, it's not just some, abstract set of rules. It has a real impact on our lives, like every day.
Right. Sometimes it feels like it's this distant historical thing, but it's actually the foundation for everything that happens in our country.
So give us some examples,
Yeah.
like for our listeners. How does the Constitution actually affect them?
Well, think about it. If you get pulled over by a police officer, the Fourth Amendment protects you from unreasonable searches. If you want to start a business, the Constitution guarantees you that right. If you disagree with a law, you have the right to speak out against it because of the First Amendment.
Right.
It's really woven into the fabric of our lives.
And it's not just about individual rights.
No, not at all.
I mean, the Constitution also shapes policies that affect, everything.
Yeah.
Healthcare, education, the economy, the whole 9 yards. Okay, so, bottom line, why should people care about a document that was written, over 200 years ago?
Well, the Constitution, it's the blueprint for our democracy. It sets up the structure of our government, it protects our basic rights, and it gives us a way to make changes when we need to. I mean, if you want to participate in our democracy, if you want to hold our leaders accountable, you got to understand this document.
Right. So it's not just about history. It's about understanding the rules of the game.
Exactly. It's about knowing your rights, understanding what it means to be a citizen, and taking part in this ongoing conversation about what it means to live in a free society.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground, but there's one more, big piece of the puzzle we got to look at.
Yeah, the relationship between the federal government and the states.
Right, because it's not like a simple top-down kind of thing.
No, definitely not.
We have this whole federal system, right?
That's right. Power is divided between the national government and those 50 state governments. And that division, it's right there in the Constitution. It's been a source of, you could say debate, maybe even controversy, I guess, throughout U.S. history.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, walk us through that. How does that work? Who's in charge of what?
Well, the Constitution, it spells out certain powers that belong to the federal government, like, declaring war, coining money, regulating commerce between states. But then it also reserves other powers specifically for the states, things like running elections, setting up schools, regulating business within their own borders.
Okay, so it's kind of like they each have their own, spheres of influence, right?
Yeah, you could think of it that way.
But then, what happens when those spheres, bump up against each other?
Well, that's where things can get a little tricky.
Right, because we've got to have some way to figure out, who gets the final say, right?
Exactly. And that's where this thing called the Supremacy Clause comes in. It's in Article 6 of the Constitution.
The Supremacy Clause. Okay, that sounds pretty important. So what does that mean, like in plain English?
Basically, it says that the Constitution itself and any federal laws passed under it, those are like the top of the legal food chain. So if there's ever a conflict between a state law and a federal law, the federal law wins. It was put there to make sure the country stayed unified, to prevent states from just doing their own thing and undermining the whole, national project.
So it's like a hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
Constitution at the top, then federal law, then state law.
Yeah.
You got it.
But I mean, it seems like there's been a lot of debate over the years about like exactly where you draw the line between those levels. Right?
Oh, tons. The way people have understood the Supremacy Clause, it's changed over time, influenced by all sorts of things, politics, social movements, court decisions.
Oh, yeah, I bet. Like a really stark example, think about the fight over slavery, right? Leading up to the Civil War. You had Southern states saying, hey, we have the right to leave, to secede, but the federal government was saying, no way, the Union is permanent. That whole conflict, I mean, it really came down to like a fundamental question of whether states could just ignore federal authority on something that big.
And I mean, obviously that one got settled pretty definitively.
Yeah. But, I mean, we still see these debates playing out today, right? Yeah. Think about things like immigration policy or environmental regulations. You often have states passing their own laws and then the federal government coming in and saying, nope, that's unconstitutional. It's an ongoing conversation, really, about how to balance national unity with the rights of individual states.
Right. So the Supremacy Clause, it's definitely not going out of style anytime soon.
Nope. And it just highlights, again, I think, that the Constitution, it's not this fixed, unchanging thing. It's constantly being reinterpreted to deal with new situations, new problems.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot. Structure of the Constitution, Bill of Rights, federalism, this whole idea of a living document. As we wrap up here, what are the key takeaways? Why should our listeners care about all this? What's the big picture?
I think, first and foremost, remember that the Constitution, it was designed to create a system that's balanced, a government that's limited, to protect individual liberties. It sets up these checks and balances between the branches of government so no one gets too powerful, and it guarantees basic rights through the Bill of Rights. And crucially, it includes a way to change, to evolve over time through amendments.
Right. It's not just some dusty old document that's locked away in a vault somewhere.
Exactly. It's still shaping our laws, our policies, our everyday lives.
It's like the operating system for our whole society.
That's a great way to put it. And knowing how it works, understanding your rights, it's not, just about passing a civics test or something. It's about being a responsible citizen, being able to participate in our democracy in a meaningful way.
Because ultimately the Constitution, it belongs to all of us, right?
Exactly. It's we the people who get to decide how to interpret it, how to apply it, how to make sure it stays relevant for future generations.
That's a great point. And I think that's a perfect place to leave it. So to all our listeners out there, we hope you found this informative, maybe even a little inspiring. Stay curious, keep those constitutional conversations going. We'll see you next time.